And here to Live Now from Fox, I'm Andy Mack. On the eve of the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine, we're hearing some interesting comments from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy. After a pointed question today about the presidency, he said he would step down if it meant security for Ukraine, peace in Ukraine, and also membership to NATO, the military alliance. Of course, this a post and his quote saying, "If it brings peace for Ukraine, if you really need me to leave my post, I'm ready. I can exchange it for a NATO membership." So interesting comments there made from Zelenskyy earlier on today. Let's bring into the conversation right now national security analyst, host of the podcast, The Strat, Hal Kempfer. Hal, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. What do you make of some of these comments, and is that even a realistic thing for Zelenskyy to offer in exchange for that NATO membership?
Oh, Andy, I think it's absolutely realistic what he said. He put a couple stipulations there. It's like, well, if we get NATO membership, yeah, I would resign. Well, if they get NATO membership, that's a huge hurdle. And you've heard that the U.S. Officials, the president himself, has basically said, kind of taken that off the table. They went from on an irrevocable course or revocable path or irreversible path to NATO membership to no, it's not going to happen. Coming from the U.S., so that's obviously part of the political firestorm of some of the rhetoric that's come out of the White House, if you will. But he said, yeah, if we're a NATO member, I'd resign, or if there's a peace deal. And what I would like to say specifically is, if you're talking a peace deal, that's a full-on peace deal. That's not just a ceasefire. Right now, the big push is to somehow get a temporary ceasefire in place, and there's some very optimistic thinking out there that it could happen as soon as this week. I think that's very, very, very optimistic. But that's the idea: some sort of temporary ceasefire, which would be akin to kind of what we see in Gaza, where they just stop shooting each other, or at least stop shooting each other quite as much as they have been shooting each other. Some sort of ceasefire. A full-on peace deal would be something that is completely acceptable to all parties. And if you're talking about peace deal, it's Ukraine has to agree to it, but kind of it's implied a peace deal. Really, despite some of the things being said, the Europeans, the member nations of NATO, kind of have to agree with it as well. I can't see a peace deal where they don't. Not a full-on peace deal. The ceasefire, that's a separate issue, but a peace deal is something permanent that affects European security. And I just, I don't see that. The other thing too is, it is one of these things you can't have it both ways. You can't dictate the terms and then at the same time pull back, which is what the U.S. has done. The U.S. has kind of said, okay, we're pulling back from all this Ukraine support. We're pulling back from making NATO and Europe our big priority. And the Europeans need to take the front, take the lead. You guys have got it. It's yours. Well, when that happens, that also takes back the leverage and influence and ability that we've had up till now to make these things happen or to put these things in place. Once the Europeans really step up into that role, which they are working very hard at doing, despite all the fractions and factions, that you deal with trying to get any of the Europeans to work together, which goes back centuries, eons, I don't know, but it goes back a long way. But despite that, they're coming together in a major way. And once they take that lead, that's going to be that's going to basically also put the U.S. in the back seat. So our ability to really, do anything there, and they will be the ones that kind of make the call. But actually, I think that what he said is very realistic. Yeah, if they become NATO members, it's a good time to step down. If Ukraine becomes a NATO member, and if a full peace agreement is reached, that's an excellent time. And he's been in office for quite some time. When Russia invaded 3 years ago, Ukraine by necessity had to declare martial law, and of course, under martial law, you can't hold elections. So he's been in office, and I think he'd probably be ready to step aside. It'd be a good time. At the end of World War II, much to Churchill's consternation, they held an election in Britain at the end of World War II, and he lost office. Believe it or not, it was one of those great strange things. Now he actually came back in office some years later, but it was one of those things like the great hero, that kept Britain together that helped keep them together and was the inspiration of a nation in fighting off the Nazis. As soon as the war was over, it's like, yeah, okay. And everybody voted and they wanted more social programs and stuff like that. So it was one of those great, strange things in politics. He probably recognizes that too, that if the war was completely over, it's a good time to move aside because even if he ran for election, the election could go a different way. So leave on a high note if he was to do that.
Yeah, inside of a vacuum, this comment would obviously make a lot of sense, but you have to factor in all of the things. And of course, I believe at the White House, there is a bust of Winston Churchill that President Trump does take pride in. So it's also interesting to talk about that. And the peace deal was what I hoping what you were going to get to, because there's been so much rhetoric about a peace deal. This would have to be so much more than just a ceasefire. You also talked about the European Union stepping up. And of course, 27 countries will have an emergency summit on March the 6th to discuss the next steps for Ukraine and Europe's security. What do we expect to happen there? How important, and like you mentioned, how rare is it for all these countries to potentially come together in that way?
Well, I would mention a couple of things. Number one, as you know, there was just a meeting with, Poland's head of state was over in the U.S. Today, met with President Trump, and he basically made it very clear, Poland's position. I heard it was a very cordial meeting, very upbeat meeting, but Poland is truly a hawk on defense matters. They are on the front lines. They are right there. For them, Russia is the immediate right threat. By the way, Poland has, as you may recall from history, has had problems with Russia running across its borders, running across its country more than once. They were essentially occupied by the Soviet Union for the Cold War. So they understand the threat that Russia poses more so than some of the other countries further in, further west in Europe. They very much understand what Russia poses. They understand certainly what Putin's all about, the KGB, all of that. They have got that very much in mind. So that's a good meeting to have. That's a good meeting. That's a good thing for President Trump to hear that kicking off the week. And then you got Macron coming in from France. You got Starmer coming in for the Great Britain, and heads of state in those countries were as well. And so what they're going to do is kind of reinforce the importance of staying the course, the importance of aid to Ukraine, keeping them going, keeping going the war, the importance of not giving Russia what they want. I'm sure that will come up. I don't know how those conversations will go, but it will come up. And of course, Macron politically is in a difficult situation right now. Starmer's in a little bit more secure situation. He was just elected to office. One of the things interesting that who won't be there this week is Germany. Germany just had an election, and it's changed. It went from the center-left party to the center-right party. So we'll see what that's all about. And that AfD party, that more far-right party, the one that was, endorsed, if you will, by Elon Musk, the one, that J.D. Vance talked to their leader when he was over there, which, is basically very anti-immigration. But, some say that they kind of have some stuff that sounds sort of neo-Nazi-ish, if you will. But they are further right on the spectrum. They had double the vote that they had last time in that election. So there's a lot of interest in which way is Germany going to go with all this as well. So there'll be an interesting European voice that's brought forward. But the other thing is, with the Europeans, they're going to say, hey, look, we are going to have to step forward. Secretary of Defense Hegseth talked about the results of his speeches. Macron, or the Munich Security Conference, if you will, and his follow-on meetings over in Poland. He talked about the importance of the Europeans taking a lead position on European security. Well, the Europeans are going to have this meeting and talk about taking a lead position on European security, and with that, they have things at their disposal. And one of the things they have at their disposal is that of the $300 billion of Russian frozen assets, 219 of those billion are actually controlled within Europe. That's huge. All right. The U.S., for all of its position in the world and everything else, of that 300 billion, we control 5. That's it. 5 billion. So frankly, what we say about those frozen Russian assets in terms of actual physical control, We don't have that much control. It's the Europeans actually have control of those frozen assets. That's a big part of it. The other thing too, and I say this, and in full candor, I have worked in the space of rechargeable batteries and sourcing lithium for lithium ion batteries and things like that, working and had discussions with European counterparts, countries and stuff. And I'm very well aware of the business competition, if you will, across the world for rare earths and minerals tied to this. So there's a very very active competition. European countries, across the board, every country I just mentioned, France, Germany, Scandinavian countries, certainly the United Kingdom, all of them are going after the same thing we're going after. And there's this issue in Ukraine of rare earths and other minerals like lithium as part of it. And of course, oil and gas is another big issue as well. And so with that, it's an interesting thing. We've put a proposal, if you will, made an offer. It wasn't an offer that met with any nods from the Ukraine. They turned around and said, yeah, that's interesting. We'll take a look at it. No, that's not going to happen. And it was part of it was based on what I would say was a very big number, saying of the aid that we provide to Ukraine, which was certainly at least more than double what the international number, a more accepted number is. And certainly, if you look at what Poland's saying, they're saying of the $350 billion that the White House was saying that we had given Ukraine, it was actually closer to $100 billion. And if you actually get into it, Zelenskyy has said it's actually less than $75 billion. And then the other issue is that the U.S. never conditioned a repayment of that aid. That was never anything in there. And what they keep talking about, well, is the Europeans loaned, and they gave them a loan, essentially, and they're going to get repaid. Not quite so fast, though, because that goes back to that thing I just talked about, those frozen Russian assets. That is based on the profits from those frozen assets. That was a $50 billion thing agreed to last year by the Europeans with U.S. involvement. All right. That's one of the tools that the Europeans have to do that. And I just mentioned the Europeans are actively trying to get the rare earth minerals and everything else that we are. If the Europeans really do come together and collaborate on this, I'm sure some are going to look at this in terms of dollars and cents and say, we too could be a little transactional in terms of our approach on this. And the U.S. could end up kind of sitting on the sidelines if that ever happens. So that's something that I think they need to kind of think about in Washington, D.C., which is be careful what you ask for. If you ask the Europeans to take a lead position, they might completely take a lead position, in which case, whatever else we're hoping to accomplish may be a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, the financial side is so very interesting because you mentioned those Russian, Russian frozen assets, but also, like you mentioned there, with those rare earth minerals, $500 billion, it's a $500 billion question that we're talking about. $500 billion of profits. And of course, we're talking about the potential agreement on the sideline, who takes the lead on this. Zelenskyy also talked about this potentially could open a Pandora's box of sorts if that gets agreed to. Is that something that you also see in this?
Oh, I see a lot of downside in that. And actually it kind of goes back to almost 19th century imperialism. When you talk about making deals like that, where, we're basically going into other countries and asking for their mineral wealth or trying to get their mineral wealth. That's what 19th century and early 20th century and for that matter 18th century, in fact, that's what colonialism was all about, was going in and basically getting the resources of those countries. With that said, what's interesting, complete side note, is down the Democratic Republic of the Congo in southern Africa. They have got a major civil war going with a group backed by Rwanda, vicious group, and a lot of international condemnation of this group. And the president of the DRC came out yesterday. One of the things the DRC has is a lot of precious metals, especially cobalt, which is also another essential mineral or metal that's needed in rechargeable batteries. There's just not that many places where you can get cobalt. Trust me, I've looked all over the world. There's not that many places you can get it. He has offered up his mineral wealth in exchange for the U.S. support in helping him deal with this rebel insurgent force that he's facing. I just find it's interesting. It is kind of an opening of Pandora's box, if you will. Now you got a country pretty far afield from Europe, pretty far afield from Ukraine, down there saying, well, we got mineral wealth and we got a problem, so maybe I can cut a deal if that's what you're into. Hey, I can cut a deal with you as well. It's going to be interesting. But the other problem is, once we start cutting deals, guess what? Other countries start cutting deals as well. This is actually what we've been very critical of China for doing all around the world, is cutting these deals with the Belt and Road Initiative, where they get mineral wealth and all sorts of other things, and then they encumber these countries with phenomenal debt loads that they can't possibly ever repay. And so now we're kind of entering a little bit into that space, and I'm sure that's going to be a much bigger political debate as time goes on.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And that also leads me to my next question, because I was going to ask you about French President Emmanuel Macron coming to the White House this week, followed by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, talking about this, talking about putting a strong face for President Trump against Putin, because on social media he said, I'm going to tell him that he can't be weak in the face of Putin when he'll have to face China next. So he wants to make sure he puts that. Is this in a larger context in terms of China, in terms of Iran, the strategic he said it would be a huge strategic mistake to not be strong in the face of Putin. Do you agree with that? And what kind of strategy do you think playing off that for President Trump might work for the Europeans?
Well, the issue there is, when Secretary Hegseth was at the Munich Security Conference, he said, hey, look, we got other issues. We got the West Pacific, China, we're dealing with that. Well, a lot of that's based on Taiwan. And of course, our official policy is one China, which is the Taiwan is not for a long time, certainly during the Cold War, going up into the 70s, our position was that the Republic of China, the non-communist Republic of China, based in Taiwan, which is where Chiang Kai-shek's forces actually retrograded to as Maoist communist forces took over China, that was the legitimate China. And of course, Nixon went to China, and eventually we reversed our position and we went with this rather ambiguous one China policy, whereas we kind of recognize that there isn't two Chinas, that there is only one China. Taiwan is a separate, independently run country. It is not under the control of the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China says, nope, that's the way it ought to be. They were talking a long time about eventual reunification. Now they're building up huge forces for potential invasion. President Biden said that we will go to war. We will fight China if they do try to invade. Not quite clear. There was some language that Donald Trump had used on the campaign trail that made it a little unclear if we were willing to go to war, in his view, to defend Taiwan. That's the thing that you talk about, the bigger ramifications, is everyone, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, other countries in the Pacific are wondering, well, if you're saying this to NATO, the biggest alliance, the most fervent, strongest alliance the U.S. has had since the end of the post-World War II era, if you're saying this about Ukraine, Taiwan has to be looking at the situation going, I think we need to kind of build up our forces more, because we might have a long wait if China comes in. And so they're concerned about it. Certainly Japan, South Korea are very concerned about it. The Philippines are obviously concerned about it. So these things have second, third order effects across the board that everybody has to realize. And I think that's going to be communicated. Macron, France, not a big Pacific power, but they are a Pacific power. All right. Britain, really not a big Pacific power. They used to be, but they're not anymore. But they are, to some extent, they do have some possessions. So they have a small footprint in the Pacific, a long legacy in the Pacific. But both of them will come in there and they will probably talk about the implications this has for the West Pacific. And I think that might help to hear that from European leaders, actually bringing that context in as to larger ramifications. And they might actually mention ramifications this will have in places like South America, Africa, other parts of the world.
Yeah, that was a good point to mention it, because the ripple effects are so wide there around this kind of global landscape that we live in. And of course, calling their bluff on one country might lead to other conversations about different parts of the world. All right, Hal, before I let you go, because I know it's the eve of this war in Ukraine, and I think it was Zelenskyy on the second anniversary that talked about some of the chapters of this war. He said year one was about survival, year two was about resilience, year three about hope. Now as we potentially enter year four, what do you think could define this year during the war in Ukraine?
I think year four is going to be probably the end state. All right. I think that throughout this year, we're going to reach a ceasefire agreement. I think this will probably lead to some sort of truce, armistice. I don't know if I want to go so far as say full peace agreement, but I really think this year you're going to see some sort of end to the armed hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. I don't know how that's going to look on the ground. That's for the negotiators to figure out. But I do think that's going to be a big thing. The other thing I think that that we're going to have to watch is what will be the tidal wave effects, if you will, on the Russian political society. Their economy is in desperate shape, and they're part of what's happened is as Russia has had to rapidly and certainly Putin didn't plan on this, had to rapidly disengage from the global economy and set up this war economy, which is based on basically borrowing money to pump up the economy. I mean, they're selling gold from their reserves right now just to keep anything going. They're selling oil at a discount rate to keep anything going. Their natural gas market has dropped dramatically. They're just having they're really dependent on, they're kind of a vassal state, if you will, of China in many ways. They economically, if they stop fighting the war, and this was an interesting thing talked about last fall, if they stop fighting the war, for Putin, that may be politically more dangerous than keeping fighting the war, because all of a sudden he'll have a bunch of troops that are no longer employed as troops, and he'll have this defense industry that's no longer going to have this massive infusion of money going into it. So he'll have a bunch of unemployed defense workers. And generally speaking, when you have a lot of unemployed people and a lot of them have military training and background, and they just came back from war, that has not been a settling situation, particularly in a dictatorship. People frustrated, they can't feed their families, they just gave it all to fight this battle from Mother Russia. So, this could be an interesting year in that regard too. I'm really wondering if Putin will be in office a year from now. I'm really wondering about that.
Yeah, a lot to discuss and, of course, a lot to get into. So we'll see what comes of it. Hal, that was an interesting kind of note about the Russian perspective of this because we talk about Ukraine time and time again, and rightly so, but also interesting you noted that. Hal Kempfer, thank you so much. You're an invaluable asset here. I appreciate your time, your insight on Live Now.